So, hello everyone. Today our topic is transport of oxygen. So, the transport of oxygen in our body, this is done by a oxygen delivery system. So, this oxygen delivery system consists of the lungs, the blood, and the cardiovascular system or the CVS. So, the transport of oxygen it is dependent on certain factors. Number 1, the amount of oxygen. Number 2, the pulmonary gas exchange. Number 3, the oxygen carrying capacity. And number 4, the blood flow. Now, this amount of oxygen present in the body, it can be in three forms. That is dissolved oxygen, the oxygen in the blood, and this flow is dependent on the affinity of the hemoglobin for oxygen. So the transport of oxygen in the body, it occurs in three steps. Number 1, uptake of oxygen blood in lungs. So the uptake of oxygen by the blood in the lungs, because the lungs, they are primarily responsible for taking the air. So from this air, the oxygen goes from the lungs to the blood. So uptake of oxygen by blood in the lungs. So how does this happen? This happens by means of a pressure gradient, that is oxygen pressure gradient. So in the inspired air, the oxygen partial pressure of oxygen, it is 150 millimeter of mercury. In alveolar air, it is 104 millimeter of mercury, and as venous air, it is about 40 millimeter of mercury. So as we have learned in general physiology, that is fixed law of diffusion, that is J equals to D into A by T, P1 minus P2. So this is the pressure gradient or the pressure difference which is responsible for the diffusion of oxygen. So due to this difference, this oxygen always flows from high pressure to low pressure. That is first from the inspired air, then to the alveolar air, and finally to the venous air. So hence by the means of this pressure gradient, the oxygen uptake is possible. Now there are certain factors. For example, in pulmonary fibrosis, the thickness of the membrane is increased. So if thickness is increased, that is the factor T is increased, diffusion will be decreased. Similarly, in the case of lung collapse, the area of exchange is less. So as the area of exchange it decreases, therefore the diffusion also decreases. Now this diffusion, it is also related with solubility. So solubility of oxygen in hemoglobin is 20 times less than carbon dioxide. So it is much less. So carbon dioxide, it binds to hemoglobin more easily than oxygen. Now we can see that this oxygen which comes to the lungs, this oxygen gets dissolved in the blood in the plasma, and from that dissolved oxygen in plasma, this oxygen enters the RBC. Now the RBC has 4 subunits, that is 2 alpha subunit and 2 beta subunit. So first it binds to alpha 1 subunit. Then the binding of one molecule of oxygen facilitates binding of another, and in this manner there is a cooperative binding. So binding of oxygen to one subunit facilitates the binding to other subunits, and in this way all the 4 subunits get oxygen. So thereby 4 molecules of oxygen bind to the hemoglobin. Now the second step, that is transport of oxygen in blood. So oxygen in the blood, it is transported in through 2 forms, that is one is dissolved form and one is in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So as per calculations, we know that 1 gram of hemoglobin, it contains about 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now from this we can calculate that the arterial blood, it contains about 19 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood, and the venous blood contains 14 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood. So from this we can deduce that the tissue gets only 5 ml of oxygen, out of which 0.18 ml it is dissolved in the plasma, and 4.82 ml, that is it is combined form, or it is bound to hemoglobin. So from this we can calculate the coefficient of utilization of oxygen. So the coefficient of utilization of oxygen, that is 5 ml by 19 ml into 100%, that comes approximately equals to 26%. Now at rest tissue utilizes only 26% of the oxygen, but in strenuous condition like exercise it may reach up to 50 to 75%. Now the second step, that is transport of oxygen in blood. So oxygen in the blood, it is transported in through two forms, that is one is dissolved form and one is in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So as per calculations we know that 1 gram of hemoglobin, it contains about 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now from this we can calculate that the arterial blood, it contains about 19 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood, and the venous blood contains 14 ml of oxygen per 100 ml of blood. So from this we can deduce that the tissue gets only 5 ml of oxygen, out of which 0.18 ml it is dissolved in the plasma, and 4.82 ml, that is it is combined form, or it is bound to hemoglobin. So from this we can calculate the coefficient of utilization of oxygen. So the coefficient of utilization of oxygen, that is 5 ml by 19 ml into 100%, that comes approximately equals to 26%. Now at rest tissue utilizes only 26% of the oxygen, but in strenuous condition like exercise it may reach up to 50 to 75%. Now about the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. So the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, it shows the relation between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percentage hemoglobin saturation. So it is basically a sigmoid shaped curve, and it mainly shows the shifting affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen and the binding affinity of hemoglobin in RBC and the carbon dioxide H plus ion concentration and 2,3 BPG. These three factors are mainly responsible for the sigmoid shape. Let's learn a little about cooperative binding. So at the partial pressure of 26 mm of mercury, hemoglobin is 50% saturated with oxygen. So 26 mm of mercury, this pressure is known as P50. That is, hemoglobin is 50% saturated. At 40 mm of mercury, it is 75% saturated, and at 60 mm of mercury, it is 90% saturated. But in normal circumstances, the arterial blood, it is 97% saturated with oxygen. So under normal condition, the curve, it generally shifts to right, that is facilitating the release of oxygen. So what are the factors which facilitate the release of oxygen? The first one is hypoxia. So in hypoxia, there is decreased partial pressure of oxygen. So due to decreased partial pressure of oxygen, there is high pressure gradient, and also there is increased 2,3 BPG. Now this 2,3 BPG, it decreases the oxygen binding affinity of hemoglobin, and hence these two factors increase the oxygen release. Now next is increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide binds with hemoglobin to form a carbamino compound, which decreases the oxygen affinity of hemoglobin, and hence more oxygen is released. Now next, increased H plus. So the H plus ion binds with hemoglobin and hence reduces the oxygen binding affinity of hemoglobin. So carbon dioxide and H plus, these two factors increase the oxygen release. So the combined effect of carbon dioxide and H plus on oxygen release, this is known as Bode effect. Now the next part is increased temperature. Increased temperature leads to right shift of the curve, that is more release of oxygen. Now if we look at the sigmoid curve, it has distinct two parts. The upper one is flattened, that is from 100 to 60 millimeter of mercury. Now hypoxia, it is prevented at high altitudes up to 10,000 feet, and early stage of respiratory disease, it is prevented because the shift from 100 to 60, the oxygen saturation, it almost remains constant. So even if there is decrease of partial pressure of oxygen, the hemoglobin saturation with oxygen, it remains constant, and the P50 value is inversely proportional to the oxygen affinity of hemoglobin. Now oxygen transport in exercise. So during exercise, the oxygen requirement, it increases. So to meet out this requirement, there is increased oxygen extraction from blood, that is out instead of 5 ml per 100 ml of blood, there is 15 ml per 100 ml of blood. Now decreased partial pressure of oxygen during exercise, particularly decreased partial pressure of oxygen, increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, increased H plus due to lactic acid accumulation, increased temperature, and increased 2,3 ppg due to more and more glycolysis. This increases the oxygen extraction rate by threefold. Next, the cardiac output increases. So by increasing the cardiac output and by increasing the oxygen it increases the blood flow and it increases the oxygen supply to the tissues. So 3 and here 5 to 7 times. The total, the oxygen requirement to the tissues, it gets increased by 20 to 25 times during exercise.